Hello, Patricia Berry.
Hello, Jessica Letaw.
Are you ready to be a white woman who talks white women?
I am. I'm going to take a deep breath this week. This is a heavy week. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, on that note, I'd like to invite all of us into a moment of silence for Jude Walton in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, and Ralph Yarl, who's currently struggling and hopefully healing. So I'd just like all of us to just take a moment in recognition of their lives and their spirits. Thank you.
Thank you. It has been a lot to carry here this week.
It has. And we'll get into that with the conversation. So, for folks who are joining us for the however many time, for folks that are joining us for the first time, welcome. This is a series where Patricia and I are talking about this book, White Women, Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. We are white women who have been on anti-racism learning journeys independently and together for many years now. And Patricia had the idea recently, the very good idea for us to talk about this book together in community with you guys. So I am Jess Letaw. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I am in this work because this is a part of what it means to me to be human with people with like the people on this planet, is just to understand how our lived experiences, our individual lived experiences, build up to our community experiences and vice versa, how our systems contribute to our individual lived experiences. And so being in this work and in these conversations is one of the ways that I know to navigate that learning and that being.
And I am Patricia Berry. Very happy to share this space with Jessica Letaw, who has helped me along my own journey in this work. And if I had to speak to why I do it, is I just recognize how my whiteness and internalized racism has kept me from truly connecting with community,
Mm.
and certainly causing harm, but also keeping me distant. So I think that was one of the reasons that I really chose to take this journey.
Mm. It's a good book. I'm glad we're walking through it.
The thing that's interesting to me about the book is how short the chapters are and how clear the language is, but how thick the ideas are.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my favorite kind of academic work. It's both very accessible as well as like I have to go back and sometimes reread pages
Mm-hmm.
because the ideas are there and then they're sparking other ideas for me. Um, so yeah, I agree.
So to give you guys a sense of what's going to happen, Patricia and I are going to talk working agreements in a moment. Then we're going to do a white lady check-in with each other. And then we're going to talk about the book, but also what the book surfaced for us and resonated with us. So it's not a book report. We don't go page by page. You will not leave this conversation with a comprehensive summary of this chapter. But it's an exploration between Patricia and me of how this book is interacting with our lives. So, starting with our working agreements, this is something that Patricia and I created together in order to allow us to sink into deep learning and deep courage. In order to do hard work, you need to kind of have agreed upon container in which to have those conversations. So these are the ones that we have joined in together. The first one is that we put aside the right to comfort. We do not have the right to comfort in this learning because this is not a safe space because our world is not a safe place. So in this space, I invite Patricia and I, and those of you following along, into loving accountability. Patricia, you and I have known and loved each other for a really long time. So let's love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up the mirrors that need holding up, because we know that kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive.
And the other one that we hold is that we ask for the speed that we need, because even though we have no right to comfort, we do need to work in this space. And sometimes that work requires deep reflection and not off the cuff speaking or learning or absorption. And everybody learns at a different pace. And sometimes the same person will learn at different paces depending on what is being encountered. So asking for the speed that we need. And we also have a value of resisting binary thinking. Unless we're specifically talking about race, we want to resist black and white thinking so that we can explore the nuance. People hold different identities at different times in different places, and how that comes into play and how that interacts with power and dynamics and community. Binary thinking keeps us from truly understanding where we are on that trajectory.
It's really well stated. And then our last shared value in terms of these conversations is that we welcome conflict. We understand well that in dominant culture and in the Midwest and as women, we are often rewarded for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement. And another way of saying that is that we are rewarded for being nice and penalized for being real. So here, I would like to invite us as much space as we need, emotional space, to be in conflict with each other, in conflict with the ideas presented, and in conflict with ourselves. You know, we do not always have to agree with ourselves. I know I don't. So, thank you for that. The next thing I would like to bring us into is the White Lady check-in. And this is something that came up, I think, after the first session, where you and I were sort of hungry to name how whiteness was showing up in our lives, not just related to the chapter content, but just in general. And I know for me, it's been a muscle of understanding the deep racialization of my entire experience, and not just as it relates to Black folks or brown folks or Indigenous folks. Like, my entire life is coded by whiteness. And the more I practice looking for it, the more I see it. So for folks following along on the onlines, I would like to invite you to answer this as well. In your mind, if you like, but also in the chat. I'm curious how whiteness has shown up for you this week. And Patricia,
feel free to share and respond to each other. Jess and I will take a look at the comments. Sometimes there's a little lag, so I encourage you all to speak with each other too.
Mm-hmm. So,
Jess, do you want to take our placard down, the working groups?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense.
Oh, there's your beautiful face.
So, how has whiteness shown up for you this week?
One of the ways that I'm thinking about whiteness is certainly for myself in I'm getting ready for a road trip with my partner, who is cis white male. I am cis white female, and we are getting on the road together. And there's so much that we don't worry about. You know, I think about Ralph Yarl and knocking on the wrong door and having that result in violence that certainly in one of my identities as a white woman, you know, in the middle of the night, that I would feel, you know, some anxiety about knocking on a door if my car was broken down. But for the most part, in this partnership, us together in this car, there's a lot that we're not worrying about as we travel around the US. And that's just not true for people who don't share this identity. So I think that one's heavily on my mind, even as I'm like packing and thinking about privilege and all sorts of other things, about how easy it is for me to travel through the world in this skin. I think that's the one for me today.
I appreciate that you are seeing something that isn't there, that you're seeing a difficulty that you don't have. That's one of the real challenges of talking about race and whiteness in particular, is that American culture, Western culture is sort of benchmarked against whiteness as the benchmark. And so, speaking for myself, I was taught implicitly and explicitly not to see whiteness and white experiences. And so they do feel invisible in a way until you start looking for them. And even then, they can be really difficult to see, because whiteness is also a system, and you cannot necessarily see the systems in which we live.
I'm also, you'll notice me muting my microphone and coming off mute. I have somebody who's cooking me dinner, which is really another privilege. Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
My partner's cooking dinner, and so I'm hearing a little banging in the background, just in case you're hearing that pick up on the mic as well. Thank you for that, Jess. So
I haven't done mine.
I'm so sorry.
Quite
Obviously, I'm like worried about what's happening in the background.
It's all good. It's all good.
So
it sounds delicious.
It sounds delicious. And can I name what I just did?
What's that?
The thing that we remind ourselves when we go into these conversations is to not cease listening as we're constructing an answer, if that makes sense. So I was not fully listening and being present with you. So I would like to pull myself back into this space and say thank you for that little moment.
Got it. So I actually had a different answer to this question, because now that we do this week to week, I think all week long about how is whiteness showing up for me, so that I can start thinking about what I want to bring in this space and talk about and reflect on with you. And I had a different answer before today. But today, when I feel like the intersections of the loss of Jude Walton and Ralph Yarl, and y'all, if you're not familiar with those names or those people, I encourage you to Google with caution. Both of them have really troubling, very violent, let me just be really explicit, very violent narratives. And Jude Walton's in particular should come with every trigger warning there is. So where I'm sitting is that these two coming so close together, Jude's loss and Ralph's struggle, feels super heavy. And it also, for me, stuff like this really consistently lights my fire as an organizer and someone who sort of, community is a verb for me. It's an action verb. I work really hard to be in community. And when things are heavy, I want to go. I want to act. I want to do. And I have done a lot of therapy and internal work around not letting that action take the place of feeling big feelings, and not letting that action do the work of punishing me or causing me to not listen, right? Because if you spring into action, and actually, if you look at the definition of white urgency in the back of the book, if you've got the physical, it's on page 156. White urgency is described as your need to be involved immediately when racial violence is exposed. You were the first to demand answers about racism and anti-racism in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. You were also the first to lose interest once it became clear that anti-racism is a lifelong practice and journey, and not a one-day sample sale. That learning itself is a journey for me. And so in this moment where I feel both desperate urgency and exhaustion, what I'm leaning on is the fact that I did this work yesterday, I'm going to do it tomorrow. And much more importantly than that, there are a lot of other people doing it with me and to. And so that desperate urgency that I feel to fix the systems that ultimately resulted in Jude's murder and that ultimately resulted in deep violence against Ralph. It's not about fixing, it's about being in beloved community with other folks that are doing the work. So I wish that I felt more peace about that. Like, I know it and I struggle to know it. But that's today, that's how whiteness is showing up for me, is working really hard to resist that urgency.
I wonder if that's something, because I have struggled with it, right? And they speak so eloquently in this book about, you rush out to your social media and do all the things, right? That you're shocked to hear that there's violence against young Black men.
Yeah.
How horrible,
Mhm.
that false sense of shock and awe to show that you're the good white person.
Mhm.
Um, what I am also sitting with and reminding myself about is that the work is ongoing,
Yeah.
that these are just loud bells in the middle of a cacophony.
Hmm.
So if we're really doing the work, what I focus on for myself is what is the system that I'm plugged into? Like you're talking about, like you surrounding yourself with people who are also doing this work. You're plugged into a system that recognizes that this is systematic, horrific, and a result of
Hmm.
systematic racism.
Hmm.
Um, that kind of like, I don't need to be the hero on social media.
Hmm.
Um,
I don't need to win out at outrage.
yeah.
Hmm.
But I do recognize the hook in myself that I want to go out there and, say all the things and stuff. And I have to remind myself, if it is not really like a call to action with a discernible outcome,
Hmm.
I think very hard about posting it, because then it's just recycling trauma.
Hmm.
I'm traumatized, I'm horrified, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other thing. Like if I haven't done anything and I'm not asking somebody else to actually physically do something, I try to like tamp that urge down, but it's a tough one for me.
Hmm. I think a practice that I have evolved that I'm only just now naming, in response to like what I'm resisting. When horrible things happen, at this point, I have a practice of not going on social media to speak. I'll go to listen, and maybe to respond when other folks are talking, whether they're folks that I follow or folks that I know. But I'm out of the practice in a good way of needing to speak. That's not my go-to. My go-to, and I think that this is actually very whole and healing, is to reach out to the folks that I know are hurting, and just say, I see you. I don't ask, how are you doing? I typically don't ask, what do you need? It depends on the specific situation.
You don't want
Uh,
to give them more work.
I don't want to give them more work. I just want to say,
I see
this
you.
is a harmful, hurting moment, and I see you and I love you.
Can I ask to unpack a couple things in there? Because here's two things that I struggle with.
Yeah.
One is knowing when it's right to be the listener and when it's
Mhm.
right to be the stander-upper,
Yeah. Hmm.
and knowing when it's necessary to do it publicly and knowing when it's necessary to do it privately.
Hmm.
And I get, like sometimes the conversations that I get in with other white women about like, I just don't, no matter what I do, it's the wrong thing.
Hmm.
Um, and then, so we become immobilized and we do nothing.
Hmm.
And I'm, just wandering my way through that and trying to figure out the nuance of it, right? So there's no right or wrong.
Right.
There's no black or white, but when you're making those decisions, do you
Mhm.
have anything that you kind of like think of as the context?
Yeah, and I really, really love those questions. Thank you. Because part of what this conversation is doing is helping me tease out practices that I have and haven't necessarily named, like haven't developed intentionally, but maybe not verbally. So in terms of public and private, I think, or when are you the stander upper and when are you the listener? So I'll start with that one. Um, default is listener. Default is listener, unless this is a space in which I hold power and knowledge. So if there is a moment, my work, for folks that don't know, is typically around housing, including accessibility, affordability. Um, And if there is a crisis in our community, something acute that's happening around housing, it is important for me to be able to name for myself and others this intersecting systems of oppression that have produced this acute problem, and help folks name potential just responses to it. That is my responsibility as someone who works in this space. And as someone who has spent a lot of time listening, right? Like the speaking comes after listening, not before. I have listened to, all of these books. Like that section alone is just housing justice. That one back there, right behind me, is just organizing and around power. And it's not just books; it's being in conversation with people whose work and practices I respect. How they do it and how they wish other people would. So after and alongside years of listening to folks that I respect who are doing work and community work that I respect, I am starting to learn my responsibility in stepping up, because after a while, listening becomes an excuse.
And I
Um,
think that's
mhm,
where part of my struggle
mhm.
is when am I the person that stands up?
I went to a really amazing talk in late November, early December 2016, by an urban planning professor named June Manning Thomas. This was the first lecture in this particular college department after the 2016 election, and in Ann Arbor, which considers ourselves a deeply progressive community. It was a sober moment, and so Dr. Thomas spoke to that. She said many wonderful, helpful, restorative things that evening, but the thing that has stuck with me is go to your corner. And what she's saying is go to your lived experience, go to your expertise, go to your people, and start there. Don't fix racism over there.
Fix it
Start.
in your house. Fix it
Start.
in yourself.
Exactly. And maybe don't fix racism. Maybe start to understand what injustice is in your corner. So you talk a lot about wealth, about resources, about philanthropy, about resourcing communities, individuals, groups, and how to move resources from individuals to groups, groups to individual, right? Like you think a lot about this, and I think that that's a really valuable set of skills to have. And in movement organizing is maybe not the stander upper, but you are in deep relationship with the folks that you work with. And even if you're not working with them, with the folks that you're in community with. So stander upper and sitter downer, that, or stander upper and listener, and then public and private. I think that's how I'm hearing that question is, when are you translating what you're doing to the people that you're in like first person relationship with, versus when are you translating what you're doing to folks beyond that, whether that's second person, whether that's community, whether that's an audience, however you want to define that. I think an audience is still a community if you're doing it right. And honestly, let me sit with what I want to say first and make sure that I mean it. First of all, I don't think making statements is necessarily a way of enacting justice. I know that we've talked about performative outrage in these sessions before. We've talked about, the need to kind of jump in and speak as a way of signaling, I am paying attention, I care about these values. I actually don't necessarily see a ton of value, without context in making a statement for statement's sake. But I do think that there are some times when we are called to speak beyond our relationships, things that we know. And I'll give a first person example of something that I'm struggling with. Or am I struggling? I mean, I am struggling. I struggle with everything, but something that I'm working through right now, which is that Jude Walton was a white woman who was violently assaulted and murdered in my city, not too far from where I live. And regardless of the identity of her attacker, there was always going to be a white backlash in terms of our perceived safety in this community. And I feel so convicted, and I mean that in the Southern Baptist sense. I feel so convicted to speak to acute versus chronic unsafety, because who is vulnerable to violent crime and who is vulnerable to violence through our systems are typically vastly different people. And the latter group is much larger, poorer, and browner. That's not 100% overlap of a group, but race, class, gender, queerness, sexuality, absolutely implicated in all of those systems. And so for me, Jude's death, I can't describe it, but the invitation is implacable. I cannot not speak on this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also something where I feel like, because of the work that I've done, the length of the work, the relationships that I have, the work that I do, I have earned the right to say
Mm-hmm.
what I need to say about violence, safety, and justice in this moment, specific to my
Mm-hmm.
community.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I'm saying is that context matters, and that
Mm-hmm.
listening to your responsibility, who you're responsible to, and to what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that useful? It made all sense in my head. Was that useful at all?
I think it did make sense. I'd love to repeat a couple things back to you just to make sure that I've absorbed them right.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about whether you're the listener in a room or whether you're the person who stands up vocally and
Mm-hmm.
leads the talk on justice,
Mm-hmm.
speaks on justice. You feel like one of the litmus tests that's important is, are you in a room where you have power and where you have deep knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you would stand up.
Mm-hmm.
My
I'll also, oh, I'm sorry. Listening to listen, please.
my question on that is, if you were in a room of people of color,
Mm-hmm.
you would still have cultural power,
Mm-hmm.
but not actual power because it's not your room.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So did I understand that correctly?
Yep.
And did I miss anything?
You didn't, but I would like to append something onto that.
Please do.
What I named, because I'm specifically thinking about my racial privilege in the context of this conversation, is if you have power and knowledge, there is always a call, rightly so, I think, to listen in moments of urgency and emergency, to listen to the voices of people who are impacted, who are adversely impacted by what's going on. And I think that's true, and I think that's real. And I also think that that is not a responsibility that we should lay on folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if they need to speak up and be heard and say, look, that this is how this is harming me, and I need you to understand that, and I need you to come into this fight with me. Absolutely. But we cannot, and this is something that white women do all the time. We say, well, and I have done this as recently as this past year. I say, well, I'm white, and so I don't want to speak up, even though in a room I hold expertise that other people are there to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I am being deferential. There's a word for that, actually, that I learned in the last couple of years that was very helpful for me. Appeasement, specifically in the racial context, which is when you're sort of over nice as a way of compensating what you think you're doing. What I think I'm doing when I do that is I'm compensating, sort of, I'm sorry I'm white, so everything you say is correct, and I will laugh at all of your jokes, whether or not they're funny, right? Like, I will not treat you as a human. I will
As
treat
a
you.
fully formed, empowered human, both empowered to make mistakes
Mhm,
and empowered to be an expert.
that's right. And it is a way of respecting the folks in the room when I understand, what I hold that's unique, that I can offer, that brings value to that room, to that conversation, to that project, to whatever it is, regardless of the various power identities that we hold.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to name that the voices of the impacted, that comes up a lot. And I think that we have overbalanced on social media, where, like, if you are not someone that's affected by this, sit down. I think that that's not nuanced enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we are to be and struggle together, that learning how to listen to each other and truly learning how to do that listening, has value, like that practice.
And I think for me, as long as I'm conveying that in a way that also includes curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
that I'm not making a full conclusion, like I'm offering you the knowledge that I have in this given situation. And I'm also open to amendment, rethinking, recontextualization, so it becomes conversational and not conclusionary. So yes. And I mean, I'm just going to name, it's hard to know until you start doing it. And
practice.
And sometimes you're going to screw up.
Inevitably.
Yeah, inevitably you're going to screw up. So, okay, I hear that. And then on the offering behind the scenes notes of condolence rather than public notes of condolence, in your mind, it's people that you have a relationship with who are carrying an extra weight because it was somehow resonant within their community guidelines, and you're offering them a note of condolence rather than performative and publicly.
And maybe typically not condolence. I will typically not add dolor.
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Just offering nuance to it.
I was saying you wouldn't necessarily say I'm so sorry. Sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry. I'm sorry.
We're super Midwestern ladies now. Typically what I will offer is love, thoughts, energy. On a day, I'm thinking in particular of a Black woman friend of mine who follows the news, follows politics, knows, when stuff happens out in the world that has something directly to do with herself, with her family, with her community. And a lot of times I'll just send her a note that says, I'm thinking of you today. And we have known each other long enough that she will either not text me back because that is not her job that day, or she will text me back an emoji, whatever she's feeling, or she'll text me back, I need X. And that feels right? Like she doesn't owe me a response. I don't owe her, I don't need to hover, and say, please make me feel better in this hard moment by letting me do something for you. But I park my heart close to her heart on hard days.
And I think, as somebody who has had, personal loss, feeling resonant with all sorts of things, that gift of saying, I see you struggling, I see you, without adding the weight of needing to be their hero. But then they could come back to you and say, here's what I actually need. That's a community work in progress. That obviously you're not just showing up for that conversation in times of trouble, but also in times of joy, in times that you have agreements and understanding because you're doing the work of community, not just in this urgent outrage, right? I think that's another indication of like what this white urgency prevents us from actually creating, right? If we take out the urgency and make it the constant work of community, we do become the fabric that we want to be, the support system that we want to be, I think.
Part of what you were saying put me in mind of an Emma, I think it's Emma Goldman, who said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution. There was a DJ in Detroit that you introduced me to, actually, who was part of the Feminist Collective.
Serafina Collective. In Detroit, if you get a chance to go see the Serafina Collective, they're awesome.
That's right. I love how they mix. And what this particular DJ said to me is that if you have not shared food and music together, you will not be resilient when you have hard work to do together. And so I have worked, ever since they said that, I have worked to shift my priority from the only work to do is work to the work to do is to be human together. And that's birthdays, that's hard days of work, that's my shoe wore a blister on my heel, and that's death in our community, that's tragedy in my family, that's birth. It's all of it. It's all of it. But being present for all of it increases the resiliency for all of it.
You and I were laughing before we came on about everybody wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes for it.
It is annoying how literal that is.
That's true.
Yeah.
So when I think about the work that I want to do and showing up in community, even though I did offer Chris to do the dishes this weekend in our community breakfast, we show up to do the dishes, you know, and that's part of the work too.
I think this was our best white lady check-in yet.
Oh, we're doing the book too. Okay.
I don't know. I love where we've gone. I was just looking at my notes from the chapter.
So this chapter really discussed Syra's experience in political organizing among other white women who see themselves as feminists. I was very much put in mind in reading the chapter of a lot of the political organizing that you do, and how those rooms can sometimes be a drain because it's navigating white feminism, which I think the more I open my eyes to the rooms that I'm constantly in that are all white and all comfortable, and I would say particularly other white women rooms, as I begin to wander out of those rooms and into rooms that are wider and deeper and doing more equitable work, I recognize that doors get closed to me, but doors also get opened. So the question that I would have for you is, did you spark any reflection off of that, thinking about your own work as an organizer and how you've moved through the Ann Arbor politics is, very white. And those rooms are often very exclusionary. And you can let me know if I'm making a sweeping statement about
you haven't been
living in the town over, and making sweeping statements about the town 15 minutes away.
I will say not exclusively white, because I don't want to erase the very healthy Asian population that we have here and the Black folks that show up. So not exclusively white, but absolutely overwhelmingly white, for sure. I appreciate the question, and I'm sitting with it. In reading through Syra's story, who talks about getting involved in Denver politics, including state and federal level politics, and the rooms that she found herself in of women who were working to empower women, and what that ended up being was white women who had no idea of how to negotiate race, even in a conversation.
And took it very personally.
And took it very
because
personally.
They were being asked
to
negotiate race.
Right.
To recognize their race.
That's right. They were affronted. They didn't feel like they should need to. And I'll bring up one of their responses in a moment. But Syra was talking about her experience in doing this as a brown woman. And I absolutely recognized every single person that she described as someone that I know or someone that I've been. One of the notes that I made from this chapter, the phrase that I wrote down was the absolute insidiousness of white urgency and how we use busyness to opt out of long-term, aka effective organizing. What I thought as a baby organizer was that it was my job to be involved in as many things as possible. And that was part of how I perceived my white responsibility too, was it's my job as a white person to be involved in as many things as possible, because white folks have been involved in breaking things for so long, I have to be a part of fixing it. But what that meant is that I had a great fidelity to my to-do lists and had a really tough time being present for any and all of the relationships that mattered to me, up to and including my partner, who has always been incredibly generous in how we negotiate our time together. And it's absolutely taken a toll. And that also meant that I couldn't be present when Black and Brown folks, especially Black and Brown women, asked me to do things, and I couldn't be present for their requests. And what I came to realize is that I cannot be present, I cannot claim to be advocating for Black Lives Matter if I am not actively supporting the Black people I know. And so I retooled from setting my sights on a system and thinking, how do I break that in ways that are generative and healing for all of us, to what relationships do I need to have and how that create justice at this unit of measurement first. And that retooling, honestly, that has settled me in my spirit and how I want to be in the world in a really significant way, and has absolutely built my resilience for the work. I don't ever really want to talk about it, my to-do lists, because they're a wasteland of things that aren't crossed off. But my relationships are in good shape.
And the longer you don't cross them off, the less important they become. And you realized I didn't live with that anyway. That's what I think about my
Mm-hmm.
that 3 months. Should I really be focusing on that? Two things that resonate besides
Mm-hmm. Patricia, you're cutting in and out a little bit. I wonder if you can pause for a moment and let's see if your bandwidth gets on board.
face went away. And my
You're not all the way back yet.
all right, I'm pausing. We're all going to pause for a moment of thought.
You keep freezing. Oh, I hate this. I wonder if it would help to turn off your video.
Turn off my video and see if that does.
Okay, but turn your microphone on.
I'm so, do you hear me speaking?
I just heard you say, "Do you hear me speaking?" I didn't hear anything before that, but you sound clear now.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave my video off for the moment because it seems like we've run into some tough time on the interwebs right now. I was going to respond to one of the things that I heard you say, and going to bring myself back to it about being in rooms and recognizing the work, the importance of community, and what urgency prevents us from doing is building a stable foundation. And my work as a fundraiser, particularly with people who are sharing wealth within their communities, the more urgent you get, the less likely you are to be in business 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I often ask clients when they come to me is, do you want to be doing this for 100 years? Do you want your organization, which you feel is very important and doing terrific work, do you want it to be around for 100 years? If you think of it like that, if you think of it as long-term change with a strong foundation, suddenly your decisions become different.
Mm-hmm.
Your values come more to the forefront because you're not just accepting money at any cost. So that urgency breaks down a lot of things. Probably most fundamentally for me is that sense of community, as well as that strong foundation that lets anything happen and you're able to weather it.
Mm-hmm. I feel a lot of truth in what you're saying. Urgency robs us. It robs us of presence. It robs us of foundation. It robs us of rest. It robs us of restoration. It robs us of imagination. All of these things we need in order to be able to build towards a more whole world, but even more whole and healed selves and relationships. I'm really struck by that. Urgency robs us.
I'm coming back on camera because this is telling me my internet seems better. You'll let me know if it's not.
Mm-hmm. You had a wee bit of a hiccup, but so far I've heard all of your words.
I do want to interject, though, with the urgency question is one of my wonderful teachers from a workshop that I took, his name is Cad Smith. He's now studying for the bar, but still doing wonderful social justice work. You can find him on LinkedIn. When I was struggling with that question of urgency, because I'm a long-term planner, and we were having a discussion in this social justice training space about how fast to move with things. And he just had a great response. He said, you have to stop and think who's affected
Mm-hmm.
and how.
Mm-hmm.
And then that tells you whether this is urgent
Mm-hmm.
or not, whether it's actually urgent.
Yeah.
And I try to take that into the work, right? Because yeah, there are things that are an emergency,
Mm-hmm.
but there's often no emergency. There's just a lot of really hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes really thoughtful ways to move forward so that everybody's coming with you. So another context thing.
I mentioned a little bit ago, the area of my work is housing, race, and the built environment more generally. And production of housing is notoriously slow, even if everything goes well. Anything larger than one house typically takes more than a year to produce, and the more units you're creating, the more homes you're creating, the longer it takes. On top of which, a lot of housing is subject to civic engagement process, public engagement processes through cities or municipalities that are responsible for managing that particular piece of land. And there is a real franticness among housing advocates, and I often feel this too, of we are not producing enough fast enough. Everything is too unaffordable, it's too inaccessible, it's too far from where people work, go to school, and their kids go to school. There's a real franticness around that. And I was in conversation a couple of years ago with, I think, a Black woman who works in the housing space and was talking about the challenges of public engagement. And I have felt this tension all along of when we preempt public engagement processes for the sake of expediency, typically the voices that we cut out are the few marginalized folks that were able to come along. I mentioned earlier, the rooms aren't exclusively white, they're only overwhelmingly white. And so when we are actually producing housing faster, we are often cutting out more voices. And I asked her, how does she contend with that? How would she ask us to contend with that tension? And I loved her response, and I think about it a lot in a lot of different contexts. She said, ask yourself who expediency serves, not what, but who.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's always a complex proposition, right? Because with housing, let's say for apartments, who is served are the people that live there, but also the developer that owns it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you are kind of circumventing or preempting, rather, a public process, are you serving folks that live in the community and want to, or are you not? There's not a simple answer to that question, but I appreciated her asking it. Who does expediency serve? Who does urgency serve? Often, who urgency serves is just the status quo. If we
Mm-hmm.
are constantly putting out fires, we are never looking around to see excuse me, LinkedIn, which fuckers are setting. Um, so yeah, I do think that about that a lot. And on days like today, on weeks like this, where I am struggling so much with the weight of what is going wrong, makes me feel like, oh my God, faster, 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 go, go, go.
Mm-hmm.
I remind myself until it can trickle in that urgency is actually not the solution.
Yeah.
Oh, such a tough one.
And that's a tough one for me too.
Yeah.
I get very frustrated with bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
My go-to is like, let's just set it all on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Not always helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Fire is good, but
Mm-hmm.
not always.
Right.
Can I switch gears just a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
I would love to talk a little bit about the idea in the chapter about white feminism, colorblindness equals racism.
Yeah.
One of the thoughts that I had is, I would say probably since there was a wonderful program, one of the ways that Jess and I also connected with is this program by an organization called Nonprofit Enterprise at Work called Champions for Change.
Mm-hmm.
And they run 2 cohorts simultaneously once a year for the last, I think, 4 years they've done it. White leaders and leaders of color. And when they called all the white people white leaders, there was a huge conversation that erupted. People felt uncomfortable with naming their whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, some of the things that kind of came out was, well, that's kind of a white supremacy thing, like whiteness is a bad thing. All of the reasons that they kind of wanted to erase the word white.
Mm-hmm.
Since that conversation, I have more and more dug into the naming of myself as a white woman as I'm making comments or as I'm raising my hand, speaking as a white woman, enculturated as a white woman. And one of the things I'm noticing is that not everywhere, but many times it opens something that was silent up to conversation and criticism and engagement in a way that I am finding very deepening. As I am wandering around in community, it's like naming the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's name the thing.
And then it becomes workable. When you are in either a group with other white folks or, a genuinely diverse group, naming whiteness lets the folks around know that it's workable, that it's workable.
That it is up for discussion.
It's up for discussion. Yeah. Whereas not naming it, or at least not having the white folks name it, either leaves it up in the air about can we talk about this or can we not, or it signals very clearly that we cannot, which means we can't have an honest discussion about race. I'd like to bring in a couple of quotes from the book that are very specific to this, and then I would like to do this for 3 more hours, but maybe we could pivot to some closing thoughts. So 2 of the ones that come in, the first one's short, the next one's a little bit longer. Just because you are unaware of your racist pathologies does not mean they do not exist. Indeed, your lack of awareness makes them that much more dangerous.
Bingo.
And then I try to usually keep my quotes to 1 sentence, max 2, but there was 1 paragraph that I had to capture because it really got at kind of the meat of the chapter, or the tofu of the tofu, if that is not your jam. One of the reasons white feminism is so insidious, and why why white feminists might more often claim colorblindness compared with white women who don't necessarily care about feminism, is that white feminists like to think they live in a fantasy where every woman is equally oppressed. You like to believe you are fighting for the rights and well being of all women and want to consider all women as equitable in that fight. It's so much simpler that way. Saying you're colorblind helps support your myth of equitability. You think you're being inclusive by saying you don't see color, but in erasing color, you erase your power and privilege over Black, Indigenous, and Brown women. Without acknowledging this critical piece and grappling with the racial oppression that Black, Indigenous, and Brown women experience, white women lose the opportunity to organize effectively.
That's on the nose.
Yeah.
That feels really resonant.
That's the invitation, right? Like, if we want to organize effectively, and for folks that don't consider themselves organizers, great. If you want to consider yourself an effective participant in justice and
And
anti-racism
humaning.
and humaning, absolutely. Absolutely. We cannot be colorblind.
Yeah. One of the interesting, so I'm also in the race to community learning.
Mhm. Oh, Patricia, you're cutting out again.
Moment, please.
Mhm.
Is that any better?
It's much better. Thank you.
I'm in the race to community learning cohort for this next year. It'll be a small cohort and then a year's worth of.
Beloved, I'm so sorry. You're still cutting in and out.
Oh, okay. I think I'm gonna save this story for next time.
Okay. All right. That's do we want to try to offer a closing thought, or do we want to concede the technology god's obvious lack of desire for this conversation?
And then I'm gonna agree.
All right. My closing thought is that the world makes my heart hurt. And I often don't feel like I'm doing enough or that I even know what I need to be doing about it. And often the best response that I have is to be in conversation with people I love about things I care about. And so I'm very grateful to be here tonight with you.
And I agree with that. I love you, friend.
I love you. I'll see you here next week.
Yes, I'm waving to you. You won't know it because I'm saying it verbally, but
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody.